Return of the Undead by Frank Belknap Long and Otis Adelbert Kline. Chapter 1. The Grave Robbers. Terence O'Rourke was frightened. There was a strained horror in his gaze as he stood staring down at old Simon Hodges, lying still and pale in his coffin. The tall young man beside him was grinning derisively. "What's the matter, Terry? Scared of your own shadow?" O'Rourke drew in a sharp breath. "I can't understand it," he muttered. "He's been dead nearly a month, but he still looks spruced up." Marvin Cummings shifted his spade and spat down into the empty grave. "Pull yourself together, Terry," he said. "He's been shot full of arsenic. You ought to know that a well-preserved corpse can't take it." Harsh laughter came from both sides of him. O'Rourke's three companions were trying hard to be hard. Tall, blue-eyed M.T. Cummings, his straw-colored hair blowing in the night wind. Little John Slater, his shoulders hunched and his hands thrust deep into his pockets to hide their trembling. Lanky, freckle-faced Clarence Limerick, looking even younger than his 19 years. Only O'Rourke wasn't pretending. "All right," he muttered. "Laugh your heads off. Digging that poor old fellow up and robbing him of the piece he's entitled to isn't my idea of a joke." "The joke won't be on him," said Cummings ghoulishly. "His sense of humor has atrophied, along with his heart, lungs, and liver." "That's right," said little Slater. "The joke will be on Freddy. He'll hit the ceiling when he sees a corpse in his bed." "It's a mean, malicious trick," said O'Rourke. "I'm ashamed of myself. We're grave robbers. We're worse than—" "Stow it, Terry," said Limerick. "You weren't so thin-skinned this morning. You agreed with us that Freddy needed hardening. He's so damned nervous and excitable that a dead fly on his undershirt would scare the pants off him." "Yeah, something has got to be done about Freddy," agreed Cummings. "If he wants to be a sawbones, he'll have to stop yelling for his mama every time he sees a calvaria chiseled off, and a nice juicy brain exposed. It's a wonder Nancy has any respect for him." "That's what gets me down," said Limerick. "He faints in the dissecting room, and what happens? She goes out with him on a date. With nail-hard material to choose from, why did she have to go soft on the weak-kneed freshman squirt?" "Oh, Freddy's all right," said Cummings charitably. "All he needs is a jolt. We're doing everything possible for the lad. Digging up Hodges is no crime, because the old fellow was a non-entity plus." "We couldn't have picked a lonelier corpse," chimed in Slater. "He lived like an animal, alone in the woods. There'll be no mourners coming to his grave." "Yeah, that's the beauty of it," agreed Limerick. "When we put him back, no one will be the wiser, except Freddy." O'Rourke scarcely heard him. He was staring at Cummings as though unable to believe his eyes. Cummings had ceased to grin. The revulsion in his mind had at last undermined his bravado. His face was twitching, and he was staring down at the dead man as though transfixed. It wasn't to be wondered at, really. The yawning grave, the smell of tainted, moldy earth, and the shadowy outlines of tombstones had alone sufficed to terrify O'Rourke. Cummings was made of sterner stuff, but the pinched and sallow face of old Hodges would have struck terror to the heart of a ghoul. In his cheap pine-board coffin under the moon, he commanded more respect than he ever had commanded in life. His claw-like hands folded limply on his chest, the charity clothes in which he had been buried, and the rough stubble on his cheeks seemed somehow pathetic, horrible, dragging him forth to meet delight worse than a desecration. Cummings took a cigarette out of his pocket and stuck it in his pale, twitching mouth. "We've got to work fast," he muttered. "Nancy has to be in by 10. Freddy will waste maybe 15 minutes billing and cooing with her in the vestibule of the femdorm, but we can't count on it." He lit the cigarette with trembling fingers. "Terry, you and Limerick take hold of his shoulders. Slats and I will lift his legs." It was a gruesome undertaking. O'Rourke was shaking like a leaf when they rolled the corpse into a tarpaulin and loaded it on a carry-cot from the college supply room. The cadaver was limp, flaccid, but remarkably well preserved. Simon Hodges had looked cadaverous in life, and death had not changed him. "Well, well," rapped Cummings, "what are we waiting for?" "My legs," croaked O'Rourke. "Damn your legs! Get going!" Out of the moonlit cemetery they plodded, 4 frightened medical students carrying a gruesome burden. Down a narrow dirt road to Miller's Junction, and then east between lonely farmhouses to the dormitories, halls, and grounds of Carlton Medical School. Frederick Simpson was a fresh air fiend. He had gone off with Nancy Summers and left the window of his room on the ground floor of the men's dormitory open to the warm September night. Removing the wing fasteners on the outside of the screen and passing Simon Hodges across the sill was a simple matter. Slater and Cummings climbed into the room, while O'Rourke and Limerick remained on the lawn with the carry-cot, hoisting the body up and sighing with relief when it was seized from above and dragged into blackness. Slater and Cummings gripped the corpse in a sort of half-Nelson and staggered with it to Freddy's bed. It took them scarcely 5 minutes to accomplish their grisly task. They descended breathlessly, their faces wan in the moonlight. "Did you tuck him in for the night?" whispered Limerick hoarsely. "You bet we did. We propped him right up in Freddy's bed, and put a book in his hands, Babcock's Post-Mortem Appearances." A gruesome smile creased Limerick's thin, bloodless lips. "A living casebook, eh?" "We shouldn't be standing here chinning," interposed O'Rourke. "Freddy'll be back any minute now." Cummings nodded, rotated the wing fastener till it overlapped the screen, and screwed it back into place. "You'd better return that cot to the supply room, Slats," he said. "Keep out of the moonlight, and tiptoe when you hit the corridor. You'll find us in Terry's room." Terry's room was 3 windows further along, at the southern extremity of the dormitory. Terry was not a fresh air fanatic, but he had left his window open on purpose to the warm autumn night. The 3 conspirators climbed in hastily, leaving the screen fastener ajar. They sank into chairs by the window in darkness, and mopped sweat from their brows. O'Rourke had set 4 wicker chairs in a semicircle close to the window in preparation for just such an event. The session of watchful waiting which ensued dragged like a dead eternity. Every once in a while O'Rourke peered out, craning his thin neck and humming to keep his courage up. Finally he saw it, a wide swath of radiance on the trampled lawn immediately beneath Freddy's window. He withdrew his head with a jerk. "Freddy's back," he whispered hoarsely. There was a scraping of chair legs, followed by a muffled oath as Cummings and Limerick collided a foot from the sill. Ruthlessly, Cummings elbowed the younger student aside. "Yeah, he's standing right by the window," he confirmed. "I can see a shadow on the lawn." "You can see? How about me?" "Pipe down, Limerick. Keep back. We don't want him to hear us." "He'll yell out in a second," O'Rourke murmured. "He hasn't seen it yet." Breathlessly, the 3 students waited for a blood-curdling scream to echo across the campus. They hoped it would be blood-curdling. What was the good of frightening Freddy if he didn't go all to pieces and cry out in abject terror? For a full 5 minutes they waited, cursing Freddy inwardly. Finally, Cummings jumped up and started pacing the room like a caged orangutan. "Something's wrong," he muttered. "He's either drunk or we've underestimated him. A lad who can—" His speech congealed. From beyond the window there had come an unutterably terrifying sound, a metallic screeching and rasping which wrenched a cry from Limerick and gelled the blood in O'Rourke's veins. This time Cummings and Limerick reached the window simultaneously. Together they stared out, their view-hogging impulses forgotten. The sound was not repeated, but streaking across the campus in the moonlight was a tall and quaking figure, its arms crooked sharply at the elbows and its coat-tails flying. "Freddy!" gasped Cummings. "Just look at him go!" "As though the devil were after him," chuckled Limerick. "That sound we heard must have been the screen ripping. He frightened slow, but boy does it take." Cummings sighed with relief. "So that's what it was. I thought for a minute it was a banshee on a tear." The three students sank down in their chairs and exchanged significant glances. They had put it over. Freddy had had the scare of his life. They were having a quiet laugh together when there came a knock at the door. Cummings' grin vanished. "That you, Slats?" he called. Through the thin panel came the rasping voice of Dr. Amos Harlow, the professor in charge of the man's dormitory. "Your door is bolted on the inside, Mr. O'Rourke. Open it immediately." Cummings jumped up, swung his chair into the middle of the room, and grabbed a book. Limerick threw himself down on O'Rourke's bed and whipped out a pipe. O'Rourke crossed swiftly to the door and threw it open. "Sorry, sir," he apologized. Dr. Harlow was a wiry little man with snow-white hair and a skin as smooth as a baby's. He fairly stormed into the room, his eyes blazing. "You know damn well it's an infraction to keep your door bolted after 10:30, he rapped. "Baloney," Cummings murmured. Dr. Harlow swung on him. "What was that?" Cummings grimaced. "I said it was only an accident, sir. Mr. O'Rourke snapped the bolt absent-mindedly without thinking." "Well, all right, but think next time, all of you. You'll turn the dormitory into a fire trap." He cleared his throat. "A moment ago I heard a very strange noise on your side of the hall, a sort of tearing sound. It seemed to come from this room. Did you gentlemen?" "We heard it," said Limerick. "You did? Then perhaps you can tell me what caused it." I think it came from outside," stammered O'Rourke. "We heard it through the window." "Nonsense!" snapped Harlow. "How could I hear an outside noise from my side of the hall? Gentlemen, I intend to find out where that sound came from." He wheeled and walked out of the room. Fearfully, their hearts in their throats, O'Rourke, Cummings, and Limerick followed him. "Play innocent and dumb," cautioned Cummings. Harlow tapped on a dozen doors up and down the corridor before he came to Freddy's room. At Freddy's room, he tapped again and again. "Mr. Simpson," he called, "I wish to speak to you. Are you awake, Simpson?" There was no reply. "Better open it, sir," whispered O'Rourke. He knew that Harlow intended to do that very thing, so what was the use of stalling? Harlow would step into the room and run smack into the horror. It couldn't be avoided now. Harlow had questioned every student on the ground floor with the exception of Freddy, and Freddy didn't answer. Harlow would get a jolt too, but he wouldn't plunge, shrieking, through what was left of the screen. He'd swing around and start asking questions. It would mean expulsion, but it had to be faced. They would have to take their medicine like men. Harlow's face was purpling when he pushed into the room. "No student could sleep that soundly," he muttered. Tremulously, the guilty three piled in after him. The light was still on in Freddy's room. It flooded over the crumpled bed and the still white form lying there. Not sitting with the book gruesomely propped up before it, but lying with its head dangling over the foot of the bed and its arms rigidly outflung. For an instant, they thought that Simon Hodges had simply toppled over, passing from the darkness of the corridor into the brightly lighted room, and seeing what looked like a corpse. Such a first impression was unavoidable. For a merciful instant, their minds envisaged simply expulsion, disgrace, and the difficulty of explaining it to the home folks. Then the real horror gripped them, shook them, and left them limp as rags. Hideously, the truth dawned. It wasn't old Hodges lying there. It was Freddy Simpson, and he looked ghastly. Freddy had red hair and a fresh boyish complexion, but now his face was corpse pale, and the blood on his throat was such a bright glaring red that his hair seemed drab by contrast. The blood had come from 2 tiny cuts immediately above Freddy's Adam's apple, one on each side of his throat, 2 tiny punctures oozing bright blood. The reactions of O'Rourke, Limerick, and Cummings were as divergent as their personalities. Cummings said, "My God!" and turned as white as a sheet. Limerick swore lustily. O'Rourke said nothing at all. He didn't even cry out. All he did was reel back against the wall and slump to the floor in a dead